So, welcome back, beautiful people, for the last talk in track 2 for today. Thierry de Pauw is going to take us through some crazy scaling in a crazy infrastructure. I'm really looking forward to hear from it. Let's have fun.
Right. Is this on? Yeah, this is on. Okay. So I'm Thierry. I'm from Belgium, land of chocolate and the non-enviable first place of longest time without government. So I'll start by being vulnerable, because, well, the alternative is being an imposter, which I'm also quite good at. So I'm bloody shy and introverted. All the good ingredients for public speaking, isn't it? Yay. So actually, it's my worst nightmare being here on stage. Yeah, well, why do you do this? Well, what can I say? I love having spoken, and after this I will just look around what's the next conference, and then I will feel horrible when I'm in front of it, and it starts all over again. Okay, so that's done. Now I can start. So, this talk is really a change story. It's a change story of 15 teams and a single monolith that wanted to go from biannual releases to fortnightly releases and reaching a state of continuous delivery in an incredibly short time frame, like really mind-blowing. So I'm going to pick the words of Woody Searle, who quoted Peter Block. So I'm not here to tell you whether you should do this or not. This worked for those 15 teams, and unfortunately I haven't been able to repeat this because there are not that many organizations that are open to this way of working. Actually, there are just a few. But I see a lot of value in what we did, and therefore I am here to share this with you. So all 15 teams were working on this single, central, huge, big, old monolith. All 15 teams consisted of analysts, test engineers, and software engineers. On the side, there were a couple of transversal support teams involved, like the architects, DBAs, build and release engineers, infrastructure and operations engineers. The monolith was, back then, 15 years old. By now, it's somewhere 20 years old. It's written in Java using the EGB technology, deployed in a single JBoss application server using one big fat Oracle database. And all of this is running in the private cloud of the Belgian public federal administrations. Now, don't be too excited, this is not AWS. Yeah. So, the monolith is super important for the agency. So it's the single piece of software that supports the whole business of the agency and serves the 11 million Belgian citizens. Now, the agency used to have 3 to 4 planned major releases per year. And those major releases were a very, very big deal. So whenever one came near, stress was rising. Development stops for weeks of code freeze, during which you had rooms full of users in test sessions, making sure functionality worked as expected and no new regressions were introduced. And yet, after each and every single major release, a series of urgent hotfixes had to be applied into production. Yeah. So in 2017, they had 3 major releases. And as it often happens when releasing is difficult and painful, well, organizations tend to do them less often. And so in 2018, we had 2 major releases. Now, not everyone in the organization was quite happy with those major releases. And a group of people, mainly the domain experts, so the ones sitting in between business and IT, well, they wanted to have more frequent releases because they wanted to see the features deployed more frequently into production so that they got feedback and that they could see how these features are being used by the users and if they are being used. And so late 2017, a couple of people came together to discuss the matter, how can we get rid of those major releases? But they quickly realized that wouldn't be too easy and that they needed management support for this. Now, luckily, management was quite favorable to the idea, but before approving the change, well, they wanted a business case. Right. So they started evaluating the effort of a single major release, and the outcome was quite surprising. So every major release had a deployment lead time, that is, the time between code freeze and then deploying into production, of 28 days. And during those 28 days, 334 person days got consumed. Ha! Well, here you have your business case. So management approved the project of improving the release process. So early September 2018, the agency got in touch with me with the question, well, can you help us go from biannual releases to fortnightly releases, and as such, reach a state of continuous delivery? Oh, and by the way, we would like to have that by the end of December. Ha! Yeah, right. Well, can you imagine my surprise? So, in my humble career, I've never seen an organization that big go that quickly towards continuous delivery. And I remember I told him in a phone call, look, it's an interesting goal you have there. It's good, it's challenging. It might be that you don't reach it, but that's okay. But well, so the good thing is they actually came to me to do this, and now I have a story to share. Now, this was going to be my very first experience working with 15 teams. Before that, I had an experience working with 7 teams distributed over Belgium and India. I wasn't too happy with the outcome because I didn't really do a very structured approach to the problem. But, well, it seems the organization was okay with the outcomes because, well, they came back to me for another department. And before that, I've mainly worked with single teams, which is pretty easy. So this time I wanted to tackle the problem in a more structured way, so I needed something. I needed a plan, a structure. And I didn't want to use maturity models, as I've often seen used in digital transformations, because they are fundamentally flawed. So they assume that improvement and learning is linear, context-free, and repeatable amongst teams and organizations. They define a static level of technological and organizational change to achieve, and they focus on arriving at a finished, mature state. And once they are there, they call it done. And so inevitably, well, you end up with the classic digital transformation project, which has a start date and an upfront defined end date, which we all know that, well, digital transformations are actually never finished. It's a continuous thing, and therefore we should focus on reaching outcomes and capabilities and adopt a continuous improvement paradigm. And therefore I wanted to try out the Improvement Kata. And at the same time, my very good friend, Steve Smith, was finishing his book, Measuring Continuous Delivery, wherein he explains how an organization can measure the adoption of continuous delivery. And interestingly, Steve was also using the Improvement Kata, but he extended this with theory of constraints applied to the IT delivery process in order to identify the bottleneck, and as such, identifying the experiments most likely to succeed. Now, usually when I suggest this approach to potential prospects, so using the Improvement Kata, doing value stream mapping workshops, applying theory of constraints, and then collecting metrics, well, most of the time I have silence at the other side of the line, and I never hear back from them. And one day I got a reaction, but this is going to impact our whole release process. And then there was silence at my side, like, what shall I say? So, but this time was different. So my contact with the agency was the internal agile coach with a strong lean and Kanban background, and he really liked the idea of running experiments and having data-driven decisions. Now later, during the journey, I learned that IT management was not that amused by the approach because, well, they wanted a roadmap, which I cannot give, because every organization is unique, and so you cannot just transplant what has been done in one organization into another organization. So, first thing we did was setting up a core team who would lead the adoption of continuous delivery. And the reason for this was pretty simple. I wasn't going to arrive with an army of coaches. So I'm not McKinsey. It's just me who was going to help this organization. And so with my limited time and availability, it was almost impossible to get in touch with all 15 teams. So I was going to interact with the core team, and the core team was going to interact with the 15 teams. And building up this core team was fairly simple. So the internal agile coach just sent out an email to the whole IT organization inviting everyone with enough motivation, interest, and background information to participate. And so we ended up with 20 people in the core team representing all roles of the 15 teams. So we had analysts, test engineers, and software engineers. And we also had an architect and the build engineer and the release engineer. Unfortunately, we never saw the DBAs and the infrastructure and operations engineers. Yeah, well, although there were also quite some problems in that area. Well, there were problems a bit everywhere, but never mind. Now, investing in the practices that make continuous delivery is actually very, very valuable. And this has been confirmed by the academic research done by Nicole Forsgren and by the book Accelerate, also by Nicole Forsgren and friends. And Nicole found out that adopting continuous delivery will actually improve your IT delivery performance. And together with the adoption of lean product management and a generative organizational culture, well, will improve your organizational performance, like money-wise, generating more money, more market share and turnover. But we have to understand that continuous delivery is actually a holistic approach to reaching the right speed and stability for our IT services in order to satisfy market demand. And it is not only about speed, as many tend to think, it's actually first and foremost about stability and about quality. So we need stability and quality in order to improve speed, because while speed stability and quality will reduce rework. And on the other hand, well, we need the speed to improve stability and quality because, well, the speed will give us fast feedback, allowing us to improve stability and quality. Now, in order to find and reach the right speed and stability, well, we need to apply a large number of technological and organizational changes to our organization. And we need to do that to the unique constraints and to the unique circumstances of our organization. And this is what makes the adoption of continuous delivery so difficult and so hard. So it starts by adopting a quite large number of technological changes. So each of them are quite difficult to implement, and each of them are quite time-consuming and challenging. But they are all very, very valuable because each of them are an enabler of continuous delivery. Now, note that I've put continuous integration in bold because we will come to that at the end. It's a little surprise at the end of this talk. Now, together with these technological changes comes a whole bunch of organizational changes, which are much more challenging and much more time-consuming to implement, but much, much more valuable than the technological changes. So let's pick one, Conway's law alignment. So one of the problems was that DBAs and operations and infrastructure engineers were sitting in both in different departments from the 15 teams, reporting to different line managers. Well, public administration. And so that generated the necessary communication overhead. In addition, only DBAs were allowed to maintain the database and perform database changes, and the DBAs weren't really acting as coaches for the 15 teams. So from time to time, during a major release, it happened that a database change was not applied. Oops. So not aligning with Conway's law, well, impacts stability of IT services. And so, well, it's a good thing to do that. Now, this problem with the DBAs never really got solved during those 4 months. We had to wait for a crisis somewhere in March 2019 before we got to a better solution. Not yet how it should be, but a better solution. It was already an improvement. So, where do we start? Do we start by improving stability, or do we start by improving speed? Now, that said, if you are ever confronted with improving stability or speed, well, you should choose stability. Speed will follow, always. But still, where do we start? Do we start with technological changes or with organizational changes? Which change should we do first? Which change should we do next? Which change will work and which change will not work in our context? So in order to move forward in these uncertain conditions, well, we need something that will help us with that. How is that possible? Right. And this is where the Improvement Kata comes in. So the Improvement Kata is a continuous improvement framework that helps us in executing and measuring organizational change. It's a framework for reaching goals in uncertain conditions. It's described by Mike Rotter in his book, The Toyota Katas, and it consists of 4 stages that are repeated in cycle. And so it starts by defining a direction, a vision, a goal that you want to achieve in a far, far future. And it might be that you never reach this goal, which is okay, because, well, the purpose of this direction is to align everyone in the organization about this direction. And then we are going to iterate towards this direction using target conditions, like improvement iterations, with a horizon going from 1 week to 3 months. So once this direction is defined, we start by analyzing the current condition. How does our current process look like? Which data do we have? And once that is done, we define our first target condition, the first improvement that we want to reach in 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 months' time. It has a set date and a measurable target, like an acceptance criteria. Now, note that during this planning phase, the team does not plan and does not know how to reach this target condition. It's only during the execution phase that they are going to execute lots and lots of experiments with technological and organizational changes using the PDCA cycle. We plan an experiment and expected outcome. We execute the experiment and collect the data. We analyze the results and compare with the expected outcome. If it was successful, we integrate the change into our baseline. If it was not successful, we discard the change and we start over again. Now, for the agency, the kata looked like this. So, in order to satisfy the demand of the domain experts, and the agency understood they had to adopt fortnightly releases. So, in order to reach continuous delivery, they had to move from biannual releases to releasing every 2 weeks. So, for the agency, the direction was one last major release will happen end of December, and from then on, all releases will happen every fortnight. To analyze the current condition, we were going to run a value stream mapping workshop to map the technology value stream. So the technology value stream are all the steps that are happening from committing code into version control and getting this code into the hands of the users in production. Now, we were going to run this value stream mapping workshop as a group with everyone involved in the whole release process in the same room, and we were going to use sticky notes. Now, the benefits of using sticky notes is that they are more fluid. It's easier to rearrange than drawings, and so you can iterate faster over the value stream map. And when we do that as a group, well, what happens? Well, it starts messy, and then it gets messier, and then it gets really, really messy. But as people are iterating over the value stream map, with each iteration, well, they build on top of each other's knowledge. So you have to understand that an organization is a complex adaptive system wherein every individual only has a limited amount of information. So no one in the organization has a complete overview about the whole release process. So in the end, we end up with a value stream map that integrates the knowledge everyone has about the process. And so this resulted in this value stream map for the major release that takes 6 months. So during 5 months, features are being accumulated. Then we have a 3 weeks code freeze. That's when we have the rooms full of users in test sessions. That's also where the 334 person days starts to be consumed. And it's also when awareness starts to rise that quality is actually a thing. Yeah. And then we have a 1 week production release. And finally, well, we have champagne. Obviously. We've just spent 6 months to get something into production, so we might as well celebrate this, don't we? And I remember this was one of the discussion points during the workshops. Yeah, but we won't have champagne anymore once we have fortnightly releases. Yes, you won't have champagne anymore, but you will gain so much more. But it also revealed a second value stream, a much faster patch release process that was happening every fortnight, designed for production fixes, but that occasionally and increasingly was also used to release features. Right, look at that. How convenient can it be? So it's a classic anti-pattern in organizations. So when the transaction cost for releasing features is too high, often a truncated value stream will arise for production fixes, resulting in dual value streams, where we have a feature value stream with lead times of months and a fixed value stream with a lead time of weeks. Now, although it is an anti-pattern, well, in this situation, this was quite key for the success of this journey because it showed the potential the agency had to adopt continuous delivery. And so from this moment on, well, we just ditched the major release, never looked at it anymore, and we focused on this patch release process. But some people were confused by that decision and were asking, and were trying to get my attention back on this major release process, asking, yeah, but why aren't we trying to reduce the lead time of the major release process? Upon which I replied, well, look, you are already doing this. You are already releasing every fortnight, but you are doing this under the radar in a hidden way. Now we are making this process very, very visible and more stable and robust in order to replace the existing major release process. So, in order to identify the first target condition, so the first improvement, we were going to apply theory of constraints to this patch release process in order to find the bottleneck. So theory of constraints is a management paradigm introduced by Eliyahu Goldratt in his seminal 1984 book, The Goal. Who has read The Goal? Right. Well, more people should read The Goal. So if you don't like to read books, well, there is also a comic version that is actually very, very good because it really limits to the to theory of constraints and you don't have the love story, so which is good. So the central premise of theory of constraints is every system has one single governing bottleneck. And optimizing anything then the bottleneck is just an illusion. So if we have a linear system that consists of steps A, B, and C, and B is your bottleneck, well, losing an hour on B is an hour lost for the whole system. And gaining an hour on A or C is just a mirage, because, well, if we increase throughput on A, we are just going to create more inventory in front of B. And if we are increasing throughput on C, well, it will create more work starvation for C. Now, we can apply theory of constraints to the technology value stream, because the technology value stream should be a homogeneous process wherein every step is deterministic, just like it is in manufacturing. And so now we are going to apply theory of constraints on our process in order to find the bottleneck. And so I asked everyone in the room to pick a green sticky note and to try to estimate the duration of every activity in the value stream map. And then pick a red sticky note and trying to evaluate the failure rate of every step in the value stream. Now, this doesn't need to be very precise. So most organizations, well, just don't have this data. So we just want to have an idea, an order of magnitude, and this is good enough. Now, interestingly, the bottleneck was not the manual testing in pre-production nor the manual regression testing, as many would think, including me. I was expecting that too. Well, no. So the bottleneck was actually the execution of the automated test. Yeah, but wait. Execution of the automated test only takes 1 hour to 4 hours, where the manual testing was taking half a day to a whole day. How can this be a bottleneck? Well, the automated test had a quite high failure rate, resulting in much rework and re-execution of the automated test, which adds up to the total lead time. In addition, the automated test had to be executed many, many times because every lane represents a version control branch, and so on each merge, well, the automated test had to be re-executed. Now, up until then, every team managed their own set of tests and decided on an ad hoc basis whether to execute the test or not and which ones to execute. Like really, okay, we touched this piece and this piece and this piece of code. Well, if we execute these and these and these tests, well, we might be okay. Something like that. So, as a result, well, no one had a clear view on how many tests exist for the whole monolith and how stable they were. And so, well, I suggested as a first experiment, well, let's implement a deployment pipeline to increase visibility about those tests. So the deployment pipeline is a key pattern from continuous delivery. It's the automated manifestation of getting code out of version control into the hands of the users. And the purpose is to increase visibility about the whole process for the whole organization, and so increase feedback and empowering teams. Now, to be honest, it isn't a complete deployment pipeline because, well, it only checks out code out of version control, does the compilation, runs the automated test, but it doesn't do the deployments in different environments because they were using a different tool for this. So from now on every change, all automated tests would get executed. And I also suggested to collect some metrics, the lead time of the pipeline and its failure rate. So the lead time was 8 hours, and so wow. So they could only run the pipeline once a day at night, and the failure rate was 70%. Right. The high failure rate was, well, the reason that were quite diverse. So first, automated tests were sitting in a different version control repository from production code, so resulting in tests getting out of sync from production code. The idea that one failing test fails a release candidate was totally new to the organization. Up until then, they applied something called test failure analysis. So whenever a test failed, they would analyze the root cause. And so if it was caused by a recent change to a functionality covered by a test, then the release candidate was discarded. But in the opposite case, if no change happened to a feature covered by the test, they were like, might be okay. What can possibly go wrong? Also, test data was not cleaned up before executing automated tests. Manual testing and automated testing were happening at the same time, but using the same set of test data, and many tests were depending on third-party services that sometimes were up and sometimes were down. Yeah. So this gives us the following current condition. We have two value streams, a feature value stream, the major release, and a fixed value stream, the patch release process. Lead time of the patch release process is 8 hours, and the failure rate is 70%. So the core team decided that the first improvement would be one of stability, which is a fair choice, given that, well, if you improve stability, speed will follow. And so they wanted to reduce the failure rate from 70% to 30% in 1 month's time. Now, given the lead time was 8 hours and they could only execute the pipeline once a day, this meant that they had 5 executions over the week, and so they would accept that 2 out of 5 executions would fail. That's for the first improvement. And then they started to define experiments. So first experiment, setting up a deployment pipeline, that was done, check. Next, they wanted to do a daily evaluation of failing tests to actually start doing something about those failing tests. They wanted to recreate the database before executing the automated test in order to clean up the test data. They wanted to have a dedicated environment for the automated test, separate from the manual testing, and they wanted to stop third-party services. And I suggested to also automatically collect lead time and failure rate about the pipeline so that we could set up dashboards with the evolution of those two metrics, because, well, the interesting thing is to see, is it going into the right direction or not? Are we shortening or not? Now, that was for the plan. The execution went slightly different, and it took me another 6 months to realize that what we did was actually an example of fear conversations. And, well, to be honest, it's actually Douglas Squirrel and Jeffrey Fredericks that brought that to my attention at GitCon, which is a continuous integration and testing conference. It's these fear conversations that helped us to surface the fear that were present at the stakeholders and to mitigate those fears and to have the difficult conversations that we needed to have in order to reach fortnightly releases. So those fear conversations are part of 5 types of conversations, which are described in the book Agile Conversations, and every organization should adopt those 5 kinds of conversations in order to reach high performance. Now, in what follows, I'm going to share 3 of those fears, but there were actually more fears, and more are described in the book, because, well, the case is in the book, which I'm very thankful for. Okay, the first fear is one of complexity. So I arrived there in September. The next major release cycle already started in June, so they had already 2 months to accumulate features planned for the next major release. Now, I wasn't too comfortable with the idea of having a big bang switch between a last major release in December and then switching to fortnightly releases in January. I thought that would be too risky. And so I was hoping there was a way we could move gradually and incrementally features planned for the major release towards the patch release process and eventually get rid of the last major release. Now, it took me quite some time and many conversations and a whole day of drawing on a whiteboard to realize and accept that this was not possible. And it was not possible because of a complex branching strategy that was in place. Right. So they used something that resembles Git flow. So they had a long-running develop integration branch and a semi-long-running main branch. Yeah, it starts to get interesting there, semi-long-running main branch. Some teams were committing directly into develop. Some teams were using feature branches, other teams were using team branches, and yet other teams were using a combination of team and feature branches. But all of these branches were lasting for weeks and months. Now, during a patch release, what happened? So fixes and features planned for a patch release were cherry-picked from the develop branch onto the main branch, resulting in develop with each patch release deviating more and more from main, and making it nearly impossible to merge develop back into main during a major release. So what happened during a major release? Well, deployment happened from develop, which was possible because develop had both the fixes and features planned, well, being released in the past patch releases, as well as features planned for the major release. So that was okay. And then they just deleted the main branch and recreated it from develop. And then it started over again. Yeah. So moving functionality planned for the major release towards the patch release process was simply impossible. So with a big sigh, especially from me, we accepted that to mitigate this complexity fear, well, we just had to have this last major release. Now, in hindsight, I have to admit it wasn't that risky as I thought, because any improvement we thought of was immediately implemented in the patch release process and executed and tested many, many times in all the following patch releases. And so, well, by the time it was going to replace the major release, it was enough tested, and so we knew it was going to work. The core team also decided that after the last major release, in January, they would implement proper Git flow. Now, this could be a surprise for people knowing me, because, well, I'm not a big fan of branching. I think branching is evil, but, well, given the situation and the context and the unstable automated test, it was a fair choice. And they also promised me they would work on reducing the lifetime of the branches so that after 6 months they could evolve towards GitHub flow, but that didn't happen. Now, in the meantime, lead time went from 8 hours to 4 hours, which is quite impressive because now they could execute the pipeline twice a day, 100% increase in feedback. Number of automated tests increased, not because teams were frantically writing new tests, no, just because they discovered, oh, we have another set of tests here that we forgot about. Shall I add it into the deployment pipeline? Yes, please, add it into the deployment pipeline. But stability of the deployment pipeline didn't improve. So we had to wait till late November to have the first green deployment pipeline with all tests green. And then it went red again for another 2 weeks. Well, you can imagine this is not reassuring IT management. It was also not reassuring me. The next fear was one of deadlines. So being part of government, the agency had legally mandated deadlines, and not hitting those deadlines was just not an option. So how would they reach those hard targets knowing that a single failing test could block a release? And given the stability of the automated test, well, IT management was quite concerned about this. Now, to mitigate this, the core team decided to introduce a manual overrule of the deployment pipeline. So despite a failing deployment pipeline near a hard deadline, well, they could still decide to accept a bad release candidate and mitigate the risk with sufficient manual testing. Now, I was not really amused by this decision because I feared that it would remove pressure to actually do something about those failing tests. And that fear was confirmed because 6 months later they were still struggling with having a stable deployment pipeline. But it had the benefit that the manual overrules were going to be recorded because those manual overrules already happened in the past, but no one was aware of this. Now everyone would see that and we would be able to radiate this together with all the problems that goes with it. And the last fear was one of bugs. And that was the biggest concern of IT management. A single severe issue could land the agency on the front pages of all Belgian newspaper and damage their reputation. And again, given the stability of the automated tests, it was a well-founded fear. So many of the tests were flaky and non-deterministic. Re-executing a failing test in isolation often did it pass to green. Yeah. So to mitigate this, the QA experts suggested, well, let's split up the automated test in two sets of tests. We have stable tests that are executed all the time. Whenever one of these fail, well, it blocks the release candidate. And then we have a set of unstable quarantine tests that are only executed at night. And whenever one of these fails, it never blocks a release candidate. But it still gives us interesting information. Now, interestingly, this reduced the lead time of the deployment pipeline from 4 hours to 2 hours. So all of a sudden, they could execute the pipeline 4 times a day. Wow. So the last major release happened end of December without much problem, which reassured IT management to move forward with the plan to go to fortnightly releases. The first fortnightly release was planned for the 3rd week of January. Everyone was holding its breath, expecting a storm of problems, and in fact, it went very smoothly, without any problems, and it felt like a normal batch release, although the underlying process had changed dramatically. So, making the fears discussable and then mitigating them, well, gave enough protection for the agency to move forward to go to fortnightly releases, and from this moment on, every release came out every fortnight like clockwork, and it never stopped. And on my first visit, after the first fortnightly release, well, I saw smiles all over the place. Everyone was super excited. No one actually thought this change was possible in this organization, and yet they did it. But can we consider fortnightly releases as being continuous delivery? So continuous delivery has a dynamic success threshold that depends on business needs. So we say an organization is in a state of continuous delivery when they reach the right speed and the right stability for their IT services to satisfy business demand. And so in this case, domain experts were very demanding for accelerated releases. And so with these fortnightly releases, well, the demand of domain experts was satisfied. So yes, they reached continuous delivery. But during the journey, I've also learned or realized, and this was the biggest surprise, that it's actually possible to reach continuous delivery without ever reaching continuous integration. And remember, continuous integration is mentioned in the list of technological changes that you have to apply in order to reach continuous delivery. And yet, they did it without continuous integration. So continuous integration has a very static success threshold. So we say an organization is in a state of continuous integration when everyone in the team commits at least once a day into mainline. Every commit triggers an automated build and execution of all automated tests. And whenever the build fails, well, it's fixed within 10 minutes. Now, clearly, with all the metrics we had about the agency, well, they never reached this success threshold. So they never reached continuous integration. Now, is this a good thing? Well, hell no. This is not a good thing, because we will never be able to sustain continuous delivery in the long run. We will be operating at a higher level of risk for delayed deliveries and production failures than people can actually stand. And so this will result in a higher level of stress, fatigue, and burnout, which will inevitably impact organizational performance, like reduced money generation. Now, many times, I was wondering, what am I actually doing here? So improvement went very, very slow. Experiments did not get implemented as planned or as asked. Stability of the deployment pipeline did not improve. And so many times I felt like very, very little, insignificant, and extremely exhausted. And yet, it happened in the most unexpected way. And it happened because the core team was a very, very yelled, motivated team that absolutely wanted to achieve this. The internal agile coach spent quite a lot of time in creating a safe environment. The core team communicated a lot inside the IT organization about what was happening, what was going to happen, and what would be the impact on the 15 teams. The very short time frame created a sense of urgency, and then lastly, and most importantly, the core team took the inertia of the organization at their advantage. They just acted and decided faster than the opposition. Now, in the end, the total release cost reduced, although from the graph, well, you would think, maybe we should keep the 2 major releases because it costs less than doing fortnightly releases. But this does not take the cost of delay and opportunity cost into account that would happen when you only release twice a year. Now, the most important outcome is creation of transparency and visibility, because well, the whole deployment pipeline made all the problems everyone was aware of very, very visible. And once dashboards were in place that showed the evolution of lead time and failure rate of the deployment pipeline, IT management got more and more interested. And it unlocked more tech coaching for the 15 teams to support them. Now, from my side, I've only spent 12 days of my time on this journey. 2 days of kickoff, during which we've set up the Improvement Kata, run the value stream mapping workshop, applied theory of constraints on the patch release process, and then defining the first target condition, and then defining the experiment. And then this was followed by a 1 day follow-up per week. And so my role in this was one of guidance and explaining principles and concepts. All the hard work, all the improvement work was done by the agency, not by me. And that was it. Thank you.